So we are in our second week of a sermon series called Make Your Mark. And we're talking about this universal desire for humans to leave an impact, to make a mark on our families, on our communities, and even in the world. And so last week we remembered those who came before us, the ones who left their marks here in this church. We celebrated their legacies, and that was a really good time. Next week, we'll be talking about how we as a church might make our mark in the year 2018. But today, we're going to be talking about the marks that are being made right now. Recently, Time magazine published a series of photos. It was a project called Firsts, Women Who Are Changing the World. These women are powerful women. They're CEOs, they're business owners, they're inventors, artists, athletes. They celebrated people like Oprah Winfrey. She's the first woman to own and produce her own talk show. They celebrated Ilhan Omar. She's the first Somali-American Muslim to become a legislator. She's in the House of Representatives in Minnesota. They celebrated Melinda Gates. She's the first woman to give away over $40 billion. Give away $40 billion. That is mind-blowing to me. Time also included a woman named Selena Gomez. She was a child actress and she's a singer now, but the thing that she was celebrated for in Time magazine is a very, very important accomplishment. She is the first person to reach 100 million followers on Instagram. For those of you who don't know what Instagram is, it is a social media platform where you just post pictures of yourself. So, you know, one's not really quite like the other. Social media, philanthropy, owning your own TV show, one's not quite like the other. And the reality is, with that many followers, she actually could do a lot of good, right? She has this big platform, and in fact, I know that she does a lot of good because she's also the youngest UNICEF ambassador in the United States. So I'm not really quite sure why Time magazine went with Instagram, but that's not up to me. So these women are powerful women, and they're making an impact on the world right now. They're making their mark. Some marks just might last a little bit longer than others. I'm not sure Instagram's going to go down in the history books. History books are actually a very good way for us to measure the marks that are being made in the world. History books are chock full of significant people making significant choices. It's how we tell our stories. Since the advent of writing, people have been recording the marks that they've been making. There's this universal desire to make a difference, to make a mark, to be remembered, if not in the history books, at least by our families and the ones that we leave behind. And we see it as early as a child who draws you a portrait and you put it on your refrigerator and they beam. Youth spend a lot of time building up their reputations and their resumes. It's why I joined every club possible to have a big, robust resume, and fun fact, literally nothing that I did in high school is on my resume now. Nothing. Young adults set out on their own, and it's their time to forge their own way ahead, and they're met with this question: what's my purpose? Will I make a difference? Parents lie awake at night wondering how their parenting techniques might affect their children, for better or for worse. You retire and you wonder, did I make enough money to live well, or did I make a big enough impact on my business or my family? And those moving into the later stages of life are confronted with the question, how will I be remembered? It's a universal desire to make our mark. And with that desire comes the fear that we might not make a mark, that we might have lived our lives and that without ever changing anything, without making a difference. In 1817, the poet Percy Shelley wrote about this. He wrote a poem about a statue of Ramses II, the great Egyptian pharaoh. He's known as Asmodeus in Greek mythology, and this is the poem that he wrote. It says, "I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. And on the pedestal, these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Ramses II, the greatest Egyptian pharaoh in our history books. He was a military leader. He secured the borders of Egypt. He built up cities and monuments and temples. And yet I had to look up all of that information on the internet. Percy Shelley wrote this poem to point out just how fleeting our marks can be. This statue of the greatest pharaohs in the British Museum, and it's just a statue. Nothing else remains. One of the great longings in the human experience is to effect change, to make our mark. But even the greatest ones fade. And we visit museums on rainy days when there's nothing left to do. So what's the solution? Let's go back again to history. Our scripture today is found in the book of Joshua. It's at the very end of the book, and before this, Moses had been the leader of the Israelites, and they were enslaved in Egypt, and Moses led the people out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Before they got to the Promised Land, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And before they crossed over into the Promised Land, Moses appointed Joshua the leader. And when Joshua and the Israelites crossed over into the Promised Land, they found that there were a lot of other tribes and people groups that were already living in this territory. And so the book of Joshua is the account of the battles and the wars that they had with the surrounding people groups. So they've battled for years and years and years. And at the end of this book, Joshua is in his old age, and he calls the Israelites to the city of Shechem. Say Shechem with me. Shechem. It's got to be in the back of the throat. This is Shechem. In between these two mountains is the city. And so you can imagine in the ancient times that this was a passageway, and it became a trade route. It was right dab in the middle of the Promised Land. And this was an important city for the Israelites. It was at Shechem that God promised Abraham centuries before that this would be the land that would someday be his family's. It was at Shechem, after the Israelites were delivered from slavery, that Moses reestablished the covenant with God and the people. And here they are again, after they've warred and battled for so many years, standing on either side on the mountaintops as Joshua stands in the valley and speaks to them like a natural amphitheater. He begins his sermon, and he tells their story. The story of the mark that God made on them and through them. The story that God called Abraham away from his family to bless the world. The story that God called Moses and Israelites out of slavery and back into the land that was promised for years before. And here they were again today, reestablishing that, settling in the land that God had promised them. And the people of Israel stood on the precipice of a new era with a choice. And Joshua says to them, "So now revere the Lord. Serve him honestly and faithfully. Put aside the gods that your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if it seems wrong in your opinion to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Choose the gods whom your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you currently live. But my family and I will serve the Lord." The choice is a simple one here. You can serve the old gods, you can serve the new gods, or you can serve the one true God. They could choose the old gods, the gods that their ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt. And just to clarify, those are Egyptian gods. They're gods like Ra, Horus, Isis, and Osiris. You maybe have heard these names before. And when the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt, that's who they worshipped. So they could serve the old gods. Now, I don't think for us it's very common for us to be tempted to serve these types of gods. It's really not in our culture. But isn't it tempting to live in the past? To remember the good old days and hail them as the golden years at the height of human history? Last week we looked back at those who did leave a mark, and we celebrated them, and that's a good thing and a beautiful thing. But how sad would it be if we only ever remembered and never moved forward? We know that staying comfortable for comfort's sake, we know that sticking to our guns and holding out for how it's always been at the expense of everything else is always the first step to fading away. And if we plant our feet so firmly that we don't budge, we'll get stuck. And just like the Egyptian pharaohs who wrapped themselves in grave clothes, attempting to preserve their bodies, their possessions, and their prestige, all they did was become mummies. They stored their possessions in their tombs and they rotted from within. Humans have a visceral reaction to rot. And we developed this a while ago as humans, and it helped us to preserve our lives. We have this reaction against rotting food because we know that it could make us sick. And so when we hold tightly to the past, insisting that we stay that way, we begin to rot. A second choice was just as dangerous. They could choose the new gods, the gods of the Amorites. And the Amorites were a people group that were still living in the land of Canaan, the promised land. And they were living alongside the Israelites at this point. And they worshiped the Sumerian gods like Amuru and the Baals and Asherah. They also worshiped any other god depending on who they lived next to. And again, I don't think we're tempted to worship Sumerian gods, but the temptation is this. The temptation is to blend in. The Israelites were settling in this new territory, and for them as the newcomers, it would have been easier for them to assimilate, to take on the new gods. Can't it be tempting to go along with the culture? To adopt the most current trend, the next shiny thing, to assimilate so that we blend in? The problem with this is that there's always something new. There's always the next shiny object. Culture constantly changes, and the problem with this is that it's all vapor. It's here one minute and gone the next. It's vapor. And so thousands of years after Joshua's speech, we too stand on the precipice with a choice to make. We can follow the old gods or the new gods. We can remain comfortable and we'll rot, or we can try to grasp at that next shiny thing and we'll evaporate. Or we can choose to follow the one true God, the one who's been calling people out of the rot and the vapor for centuries. The one who called Abraham out of his homeland and into a new territory so that he and his family would be a blessing to the world. The one who delivered the people of Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery and into the promised land and into something bigger and better than they could ever imagine. The God who flipped the world upside down, welcoming the immigrant and the slave and the woman and the oppressed. The God who became human and lived among us in Jesus to show us just how much he loved us. The God who established the church and through the church established orphanages and hospitals and schools all over the world. The God who continues to make lasting marks here and now as we care for the least and the lost and the lowly. And God isn't just working somewhere out there. God is working here and now, in you and through you. 2 weeks ago, our congregational care team was commissioned, and since then, they've made dozens of calls and home visits for people in our community who desperately need that care. Every Wednesday night, children, youth, parents, and adults join together in a meal, and they fill up the fellowship hall. Every table is full. After the meal, we pray together, we study the Bible together, we connect. Kids are being discipled. Parents are being equipped. People are being nourished physically and spiritually. As a church, you donated thousands of dollars to UMCOR to aid in the relief for those who need it. Today, we're celebrating the youth group who went on a mission trip this past summer, and so I invite you to stay afterwards to hear how God worked in and through them and made marks in the communities that they visited. God is at work here, and God is making marks through you. The desire to leave a mark is a universal one. And we can try to do that by holding on to what used to be. Or we can try to make our mark by riding the waves of the next current trend. Or we can join a movement that has lasted thousands of years because of a God who doesn't rot or evaporate. We can follow the God who makes his mark on the universe that he created. We can serve the God whose marks are of eternal consequence. And when you join in on this work that's already being done, when you join in with God, your mark will make a difference. Your mark will last. This past week, you may have received a card from us. It looks like this. If you did not receive a card from us in the mail, we've got some in the back, and we invite you to take one home with you on your way out. This is a pledge card. And each year, we'll be sending these out, and really the purpose is very simple. We want to know what kind of mark you will make this upcoming year. And so God is calling us to steward our lives. We've been given time, talent, treasures, and we're called to give a portion of that back to God. And so we want to know how you're going to make a mark. You'll see on this card that you'll be able to tell us how you can make your mark through your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness. If you're a member here, those are the vows that you took when you joined the church. And so we ask that you consider how might God use you this next year. These cards will help guide us as a church. It'll help us plan our programming for the next year. It'll help us plan our budget for the next year. It'll help us determine and discern how God is already working in your lives and how we can come alongside you to make that happen. And so for you, maybe you're going to offer to serve in the place that needs it the most, and maybe that's a step for you. But what I can tell you is that it will make a mark on you and on someone else in this church. Maybe you haven't ever given before financially, or maybe even put it in your budget, and this year is your year that you're going to try that. That will help us greatly. Maybe you're going to invite a friend for the first time to church. Tell us, how will you make your mark? And so I invite you to take this and pray over it this week. Think about it. How is God going to use you to make a mark? God invites us to choose for ourselves this day who we will serve. We can choose to serve something that rots or something that evaporates. Or we can choose to serve the one true God who's making marks across time and space. Who will you choose? As for this church, we will serve the Lord.